Welcome back to Amplifying Our Voices. I'm your host, Patty Hayak. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Naomi Asher. She's an author, a consultant, foster parent, and a burnout researcher. This episode is a deep dive into burnout. She breaks it down in a way that most of us have never heard before. She describes it as a values misalignment. Consider this your permission slip to pause, breathe, and realign. Let's get into it. Hello, Naomi. Thank you so much for meeting with me today. I am so excited to talk to you and learn a little bit more about you.
To be here. Thank you so much.
I'm excited for others to hear about your story, and I like to start off with your upbringing. Where does your story begin?
It's funny because I don't talk about this a whole lot, but I was actually born in the UK, just outside of Oxford, England. And I moved here to the States when I was 9. And so I am a multicultural kid, it's funny because I don't think that most people really think of me that way. I don't necessarily come across as being multicultural. But it has impacted my life in a lot of ways, just how I had to learn pretty early on how to adjust really quickly to situations and fit in because 9-year-olds are mean. And so it definitely did impact me quite a bit when it comes to that. What I talk about a little bit more is that my mom grew up in poverty and the cultural impact that has had on me. I grew up in middle class, but my mom grew up in poverty. And so a lot of those poverty culture pieces have impacted my life quite a bit. My husband, who did not, he actually grew up more in the wealth class. That's really impacted a lot of pieces in our relationship. And so I really enjoy talking about culture and the impact that our childhood and like the generations before we are born, how that impacts our attitudes and the way that we interact with the world and all of those kinds of pieces.
Yes, absolutely. I can imagine. What early experiences shaped who you are today? Or is there anything that stands out from your childhood that really shaped who you are today?
That move really did impact me a lot just because I was a very different kind of kid before moving here. I had a much more confidence. The school system over there encouraged creativity a lot. And so I remember you would get like this little hung around your neck and it had like a little pie chart on it. And you could go to whichever station you wanted to. And it was like math, science, like all these things. And you would just walk around the room all day. Like you could, and you had a lot of autonomy over, like, I want to go do art now, or I want to go do this. And you would go to the table, and if there was space, you would jump in when you're ready. And moving here, it was the exact opposite. So it was you sit at your desk, you don't talk unless you're spoken to, you get a very structured break at this time, you get a short lunch break. And it was so completely different. I was labeled as a bad kid. And because if I didn't feel like doing math, I had kind of been told I didn't have to do it right now. And so I was put in remedial classes and I didn't need to be in there's no shame in it, but I didn't need to be in those classes. They put me in them because my working style was so different. And so I learned at such a young age that if you don't figure out how to adjust quickly, you're not going to make it. And what that ended up teaching me in a way that I don't like is it kind of taught me to assimilate.
Mhm.
And for a long time, I lost, I think, my own voice and like what my character, my personality, how do I really feel about things or what do I really want to do? And it was recent, actually. I was talking to somebody that I went on vacation by myself and I love doing that now. I love being by myself on trips or just out of town because I don't know what I want to eat because I'll go wherever you want to go, right? Like I kind of got ingrained in me that what do you want to do? Where do you want to go eat? I just learned to assimilate so well that I don't know what my own preferences are. And so it's been a really fun rediscovery in adulthood to say, yeah, I love tacos and margaritas. No, I don't like that. Yes, I do like that. And not just kind of go with the flow as easily as I've kind of taught myself to.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Gosh, I relate with that so much because I'm also a kind of go with the flow type of person. I call myself kind of like a chameleon. I can blend
Yep.
in with
different groups. If it's time to be
Mhm.
serious, I can be serious. If it's time to have fun, I can be fun. I relate to that so much. And then also the part where you're talking about those
Yeah.
labels that put on us at such a young age. And then we start to believe those labels. We become those labels. And then here we are in adulthood having to unlearn
Mhm.
those things that were put on us. Can you talk a little bit more about those labels
Yeah.
and what work have you been doing to unlearn those things?
Yeah. So a big part of what I talk about is burnout, obviously, because that's what all my research has been focused on. And a big piece of burnout is values. And when we talk about burnout in work and we talk about that being values based, a lot of people immediately jump to thinking that that is in reference to the organization as a whole. So, do my values align with the mission of the organization, right? We think about it on a bigger scale. And the reality is, it's actually things like, do you value my working style? Do you value
Mhm.
my opinion? Do you, and this is something I've been coaching teams on, is just speaking, I'll make it personal. I love work. If you tell me I'm only allowed to work 40 hours, I'm going to be frustrated because I want to work more. I enjoy it. I'm in a life phase where I can and I want to, and it's a big part of who I am. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, understanding that for me, work life balance being 9 to 5, that's not good for me. That's not what I want. And so, if an organization is very structured that way, it's not going to fit with my values. And so, everything kind of comes back to this values alignment as far as I like a lot of autonomy. I don't want to be told how to do something. I want very clear expectations and clarity around what should this look like at the end, but then don't tell me how to get there. I'm going to get there my way.
Mhm.
Versus somebody else may want much more support and check-ins along the way. And so if we're not understanding, respecting, and supporting somebody else's values when it comes to work life balance, autonomy, support, clarity, boundaries, those kinds of things. That's where burnout sets in. That's where conflict sets in because we're not taking the time to understand that people are not the same. And
Mhm.
you don't just create a job description and put a little box and then drop somebody in it. So a big piece
Mhm.
of my relearning is understanding who am I, what are my values, and then where does that fit and support organizations in the best way possible.
Man, thank you so much for that. So that's a great segue into burnout and what you do today. But okay, let's talk a little bit more though about you've spent many years, I think over
Mhm,
17 years in the nonprofit world. Can you
mhm.
talk a little bit about your experience there and then how that led you to what you're doing today?
Absolutely. It's a long story. I'm not gonna get into how I ended up in nonprofit, but, all indicators said that I needed to be working in nonprofit management, and, I've had a wonderful time and a great career doing that. What happened was I started my PhD process, and I started noticing around me a lot of other people were burned out when I wasn't, and so I was really curious about that. I wanted to dig into that more. And so as I started my research, that's what I wanted to focus on is executive burnout, specifically with nonprofit leaders. It expanded from there. I started looking at other things as well, but that was really my original intent. So I finished, finally graduated this
Good.
year,
Yeah.
and so I kind of have those like the burnout factors and the things that kind of create that burnout. And then the symptoms that we do see later, like when you start feeling overworked and underpaid, all of that. But the main thing was for me, I never felt burned out. Like I had 17 years of feeling great, loved it, no issues. And then I took a position that was not aligned with my values, but I didn't understand that going in. And I'll take responsibility for the fact that I don't think I realized what my values were. I didn't know the autonomy piece. I didn't know the clarity piece. I didn't know that I do like working a lot of extra hours. Like all of those kinds of things. I didn't understand those things about me enough to really advocate for that. And I just found myself in a place where there was no transparency of process. There was no clarity around decision making and boundaries, and no real clarity around expectations. And I just found myself in a place where in less than 6 months, I was completely burned out. And so living through that and having to do the work to evaluate how did I get here? What happened? Really took this abstract idea of burnout and all of this research and made it so incredibly personal that now I understand it to such a deeper level that I can
Mhm.
walk with other people through it, because most of us haven't done the work to figure out what those values are. Most of us, because we don't need to, because we just find ourselves in a place where we're able to put those, we're either able to lean into it or we deny that we are feeling burnout. And then we stick a label on it that it's because we're overworked or underpaid.
Mhm.
So it's kind of understanding that like bigger level. And I think in nonprofit, especially because we're so focused on like, we've got to get the client service, we've got to raise the money, we've got these expectations put on us that we don't necessarily have time to figure out, why am I exhausted? Is it
Mhm.
exhaustion or
Right.
is it burnout? Is it misalignment? So I think it's an interesting industry to look at for burnout, especially because there's a lot of that compassion fatigue. There's just a lot going on. So,
Right. I can imagine. What did those years teach you about either systems or the emotional cost of service-based work?
yeah, so it's interesting because in nonprofit, there's still such a focus on overhead and where are you spending money and all of these kinds of things where you don't get that in the private sector. You don't even get it as much in government as I think you do in nonprofit. And so the idea of spending money on training, development, that's very challenging. It's a really hard sell. And so what that does is when we look at the burnout factors, which are values alignment, conflict, and competency, if I am in a place where there's no opportunity for me to learn self awareness or to learn about the others around me because we're not investing in our teams the way that we need to, then all of that kind of begins to set in. And so when you look at the infrastructure of nonprofit, we have to start shifting, because what happens is when we've got burned out CEOs, they make bad decisions, or their decision making is not going to be as strong. It's not going to be as sharp. They're a high risk factor for substance misuse, for embezzlement, for suicide. And when you then start pulling the numbers on those things, there is a higher percentage of nonprofit professionals that experience these types of risk factors than other organizations. And I think that's because the infrastructure is not there to support the professionals, but the infrastructure is also generally not there to put the checks and balances in place. There's not the
Mhm.
financial oversight most of the time with nonprofits that there is with other organizations. And so there's just so much work that has to be done when it comes to really finding ways to best support the structure and the infrastructure of our nonprofits. I've always known it was an issue, but now I'm like,
Yes.
so much more fired up about it and passionate about it.
Well, I bet. I mean, gosh, you talked about so much there. And I've heard you speak about this in the past too, where you're saying it's not a compensation issue. It's not
Mhm.
a passion issue. People that are in this service, they're not going in it because of the money. They're doing it because
Right.
they are passionate about this type of work. How do we solve this issue? What advice would you give to organizations that are dealing with this, but then also individuals, and what can they do?
Yeah. So I think for individuals, there has to be, this, what I talk about a lot is intentional rest. So for individuals, I always challenge to take intentional rest. This is not vacation. Your vacation, if you're looking forward to vacation, you think that you're going to come back so refreshed and not burned out. That is a dream world, because when we go on vacation, we come back to twice as much work because we've got to catch up on all the stuff that we missed while we were gone. If you think that it's going to solve your burnout, it's not. So for individuals, the idea of intentional rest is not like taking a week or a month. Like, it's not a sabbatical. It's about taking a day or two to really determine Am I feeling burned out? Am I feeling the kind of exhausted where it's every day I wake up already tired? I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't have motivation to do anything anymore because I'm just so, it's like close to depression when you have real burnout. So if you are in that place or you feel like those things are beginning to set in, that's when you need to stop and look at, is there a values misalignment? What are my real values? What is truly important to me, my personality, who I am as a person? And then looking at conflict. Is there conflict that I am not addressing? Because living in low level
Mhm.
conflict will create that. It will create this feeling of burnout. And then lastly, am I feeling confident in work? And if not, what do I need to support that? So then on the organizational side, are we giving people opportunities to do these things, to take reflection, to take intentional rest that's not vacation? Are
Mhm.
we putting things in place to allow people access to coaching, personality assessments, to team building? Are we putting things in place to ensure that our organizations are looking at conflict, that they've got clarity, that our checks and balances are appropriate and that they're in place? And then are we investing in the staff? So for me, organizations, boards, especially if it's a nonprofit, that board needs to be asking the right kinds of questions to ensure that checks and balances are in place. So if you have a burned out leader, they're not going to they're not going to have the flexibility or ability to make some incredibly damaging decisions. But we also need to make sure that they're getting the support that they need through coaching, through team development, through facilitation, mediation. I think too many nonprofit leaders just come up from the front lines of helping people and we say, "Oh my gosh, you've got the biggest heart. You should now supervise 100 people, 200 people."
Mhm.
And they don't have the skills to do that. And so, of course, they're not going to thrive in that. But then, as nonprofit boards, they don't want to deal with that either. And so it's like, well, figure it out, I guess. And then those spirals start. So we've got to do a better job of board governance.
That
I know that was a
that is
lot.
so good. No, that's amazing. Okay, what do leaders often misunderstand about burnout, and what do you wish they knew?
I think a lot of leaders don't know the difference between being tired or exhausted and burnout. And I think that's a really important thing to understand because if you just need a break, that's we all need a break sometimes. And my response to that is also that you don't need permission to take a break. You don't need permission to rest. But most of us feel like we do. We're so achievement focused that we think that we are not valuable if we're not doing. And so if my schedule
Mhm.
is not over full and I don't have all of these outcomes for every day of work, that I'm not a valuable person. And that's not true. So for my
Mhm.
first thing is if you're exhausted, it's okay to rest and you don't need anybody to give you permission for that. If you
Mhm.
are burned out, it is irresponsible to remain in a leadership position. So that may just be a sabbatical, but it needs to be very intentional. If you are truly burned out, where you are waking up every day and you are exhausted before you start the day, you don't have motivation to do your job, let alone go out with friends. Like very few people are actually in full burnout. But if you are, it's a hard thing to say and it's a harder thing to do. You got to step out because it's irresponsible to stay in that role. And so we always want to catch it before we're at that level, but understanding the difference and then taking intentional rest, taking breaks without feeling the need to apologize for it. And then also recognizing that you have value because you are a human and not because of any accomplishment or anything that you do. I think that really helps that burnout as well because once we recognize I have value just because I'm a person, some of that stress and pressure begins to leave and we're able to just kind of
Mhm.
say, all right, well my good is good enough because
Mhm.
I'm giving the best that I can and now there's no additional pressure, if that makes sense. And so I think it's all about understanding our value, our need for rest, and then catching it if we are headed into burnout.
That is absolutely spot on. I grew up with seeing my parents just constantly work. They would even tell us, if they were to see us sitting down and resting, they'd be like, "No, there's always something to do around the house. You gotta
Mhm.
clean or whatever." And I never saw my parents rest. So for me,
Mhm.
I've had to unlearn that, no, rest is also being productive, but then also
Mhm.
having leaders that can help us recognize that and giving us permission
Yeah.
to rest, like you're saying.
Yeah.
So I love that you're talking about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I also love how you talk about creating trauma informed spaces. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, as a foster parent, and I've been around a lot of the nonprofits that I've worked for, focus around helping trauma, predominantly kids that have lived through significant trauma. And one of the things that I've seen is that we have all these like trauma informed parenting, trauma informed teaching, trauma informed after school. We do a lot with trauma informed for kids. And that's transitioned into high schools, which is good. It's beginning to come into colleges and universities are talking about, okay, we need to have some trauma, a little bit more trauma informed approaches to keeping kids enrolled in university, that kind of thing. But what we don't do is transition that then into the workspace. And so these kids that have had understanding from like 5 years old to potentially 20 something are now put into a work life where everybody around them's like, get over it, you're an adult. And so for the first time, they're kind of like thrown in with no support system. And so if we are moving into a place where we want to have inclusive workspaces that really do represent our communities and represent, support everybody equally, and we want people to thrive and do well, we have to talk about trauma informed spaces. We have to know how to be clear with other people. We have to know how to work together. We have to know how to communicate better. And one of the things I talk about too is when we say communication, we always think, well, you say words. I know what that means because I also speak English. So okay, so Liz, if we're speaking in English, you say words to me. I know what those words mean, and I will respond based on those words
Mhm.
because that's communication. But the reality is that is just not true, especially not in the world today, because you send me a text and it doesn't have an emoji in, and I'm going to think you're mad at me. Or you come in my office and you think that you're just being direct and clear, and I think that you're having a terrible day or that you're being aggressive. And we're not taking the time to figure out all of the nuance of communication. And a lot of the time, our leaders will say, I don't care. It's not my job to interpret all of that to you. Well, that's fine if you want to feel that way, but your employees are going to respond accordingly.
Mm,
So they're going to respond to you, to how they believe you intended that communication, not to how you intended it. And
right.
so much of trauma focused workspaces involve that. Like if I'm somebody that grew up in trauma, I'm going to have less confidence. I'm going to have less ability to interpret your, especially if you're short with me. To me, I'm going to assume probably that you're mad. If I grew up in a household where yelling meant the cops are going to be called or a fight's about to happen or those kinds of things, now I'm going to be in fight or flight mode. And then we're going to
Mhm.
have all kinds of different things that happen out of that that impact our entire organization. And it's going to be a mess and nobody's going to know why, right? And so when we talk about trauma informed workspaces, it's really important because we're saying that we want to work with everybody and anybody can have trauma. This is not just reserved
Mhm.
for a certain demographic of people. Like there is trauma all over our world and community. And so we have to be able to understand not only ourself with self awareness, we have to be able to understand how we impact other people and what that looks like.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Preach, girlfriend. Okay. You're speaking to something that I would love to see in all the workspaces, whether that's
Mhm.
nonprofit or private sectors. If you're talking to a leader, how do we create that or how can they educate themselves? We're not telling them to be a therapist, right? But they do have
Mhm.
to have some sort of knowledge around this. Speaking to those leaders, what advice would you give them to create these trauma-informed spaces?
So the first thing I think is understanding your own values alignment. And once you do that for yourself, you can very quickly recognize, oh, this is why I am this way, and this is why other people are not the same as me. So I think that's the
Mm,
first piece of self-awareness is recognizing not everybody interprets a situation the same, and not everybody
mhm,
is driven by the same or motivated by the same things. And so that's the first piece. I'm an Enneagram coach as well, so I rely heavily on the Enneagram, and it shows you kind of your motivations and behavioral patterns, and that really puts a lot of those pieces into place as well. So that first step is truly just recognizing not everybody is the same as me. I once heard somebody tell a story about an event that I was present for, and it was a situation that I witnessed. And it sounded like a completely different thing, but neither of us were wrong. Like you take the facts, and the facts were all the same, but the
mhm.
interpretation was completely different because we have different lived
Right,
experiences and different backgrounds.
right.
And so that's number one, always going to be number one. And then from there, what we need to do is really begin to understand with people. When I talk about behavioral patterns, I hate using the word trigger because it's one of those words that it's just been kind of co-opted, I think, by society and used in inappropriate ways. But when we talk about behavioral patterns and recognizing behavioral patterns in others, we have to recognize if there's something that we are doing that impacts somebody else. So if I like, for example, I am usually high energy and very like positive and smiley, whatever. I have days though where I'm not having a bad day. I'm just lower energy. And when I have teams, I've had teams that work for me and I'll come in and just be low energy and I'll hear them being like, "What happened? Is Naomi in a bad mood? What's going on?" All that kind of thing. I'm like, "Guys, I'm not in a bad mood. I'm just low energy today. Obviously something's going on. What do you think's going on?" Da, 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 da. Well, I wasn't in a bad mood before, but now I am because y'all are putting these assumptions on me. So I had to be really clear, especially when I had staff of like very young employees who hadn't had a ton of work experience. So I would just come in and be like, "Hey guys, where is everybody today? On 0 to 10, how are we feeling? My energy is low. I'm not upset about anything. My energy is low. I maybe have a shorter fuse today than maybe another day. If you want to talk to me about something that you think I'm not going to like, let's postpone it until tomorrow." And that ability to just be honest, most of us are so uncomfortable with that. Like I can't admit I'm having a bad day, or I can't admit that today is not a good day to have a conversation with me. Sure you can. We're all people. We're all humans. And so it's just
Mhm.
really and truly about understanding ourselves, our own behavioral patterns, and then the people around us and how we can interact and how do we be really clear so that we can avoid a misunderstanding.
Yes, that work is so important. Just, I call it like the power of the pause. Just pause, go within, and
Yep.
have a moment of self reflection. Why
Mhm.
am I feeling this way? Or why am
Yep.
I reacting this way? Or, just pause. There's a lot
Yes.
of power in that. So, thank
Yes.
you for speaking on that. Okay. What part of your lived experience do you feel most informs your consulting work today?
Oh, goodness. Honestly, I think that all of us have, and I've always kind of said this, that everything that's happened in my life has led me to the next opportunity. And that's really hard sometimes when it's not an opportunity that we wanted to come up. This whole transition into being full time consulting, I knew I wanted to do it at some point. The timing was not where I had chosen for it to be necessarily, or where I wanted that to land. But I think everything up until this point has given me what I need to be able to do this. And so, including getting incredibly burned out and finding myself in a situation that was just very undesirable. And I don't
Mm,
wish that on anybody, but it taught me what I needed to be able to work with other people. So I think finding myself in a position where I was very misaligned and just not in a good spot really brought a lot of clarity and helped me take all these positive experiences and reframe them and look at that differently and say this wasn't by accident, this was intentional. So how can I then help other leaders maintain that optimism, positivity, hope, and avoid low level conflict, messiness, like that kind of stuff. I think all of my lived experience, honestly, being multicultural and kind of walking through the world a little bit differently, I think has really helped prepare me to speak to others in a way that can be meaningful and that I have a level of understanding for almost anybody. Like I think that I can identify and connect with almost anybody because of the amount of lived experiences that I've had.
I bet. Thank you so much. I know you are adding so much value to these organizations that you're meeting with and consulting with. It's wild because you kind of had to go through it to be able to be in the space that you are now, to
Mhm.
be that teacher. And you did the research. It led you to your PhD, and now you're consulting because you see the gap and you are being part of the solution, which I love. I want to talk a little bit about you being a foster parent. What led you to that decision of becoming a foster parent?
I was the director for a CASA program, and we worked in the court system for abused and neglected children. And I started seeing really clearly over and over again that kids older, like teenagers and preteens, they have less opportunity to go into a home. A lot of them were going into residential facilities. And so it was important to me. That was kind of a catalyst for me wanting to foster teens. And then as we were going through the training classes, I was like, well, I don't know, maybe we should start with little kids. And my husband, who kind of wanted little kids, had flipped and he was like, no, there's such a need. I think that this is what we need to do. And so we've just kind of always found ourselves in a situation where if we disagree on something, we're able to like where one of us is weak, one of us is strong, and we've flipped through that. And so it felt very clear that I was having a moment of just being scared, and he was able to step up and say, "No, this is something that we can do if we do it together." And what we found is honestly, we haven't taken any toddlers in our house, but when I'm around toddlers, I'm like, God bless the foster parents that are willing to take toddlers because they are terrifying to me. Teenagers, you can have a conversation with them. It's worked out really well for us. We just really enjoy being a home for teens, and I don't think they're that scary. So I encourage other foster parents so I do a lot of training now for Department of Children's Services and teaching other foster parents, supporting other foster parents, and like, they only look scary on the outside. Toddlers look cute on the outside, but they're very scary on the inside. So let's figure out, like, what do you want to deal with? But yeah, I love working with teenagers. I think there's huge opportunity to really help shape their transition into adulthood, and they just desperately need people to invest in them when they come into the system.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about that. How did fostering influence your understanding of trauma, burnout, or even emotional labor?
So I talk a lot about like cultural differences in understanding people. And one of the biggest pieces for me has been recognizing that some of the kids that come into our home that look the most like us, we expect to assimilate the easiest. It's been the opposite. And so that really helped reinforce for me that the idea of cultural difference and like deep rooted trauma and hurt, how that impacts our ability to function in the world in a family environment, but then in a workspace, like all of those things. And so I think that there's so much that I've learned about myself through foster parenting that I would love for other people to get to learn about themselves as well. And how we interact with each other, how we learn to love and support each other is just it's created such a deeper sense of self-identity, but then also how to work with other people that maybe we don't initially anticipate it being a challenge, I guess.
If you could speak to your younger self, the one starting her nonprofit journey, what would you tell her?
I've struggled with this lately because on one hand, I want to give warnings and say, oh my gosh, don't do this or don't do that. But to go back to what I said earlier, I think that every experience, when we embrace our life experiences, even the negative ones, as opportunities for growth and opportunities for learning, I wouldn't take anything back at this point. And so I think I would just say, "Hey, hang in there." Like, it's gonna be hard, and you've chosen a very hard road. And on one hand, like, run and go work somewhere else for money. Your life will be easier, but I don't know, that life might not be easier. So I would just say, like, hang in there and stay true. Continue to stay true to who you are. And that is something that I think I am proud that I have figured out who I am and that I've stayed true to my values. I've stayed true to my core, and I would say, like, for sure, like, double down on that. Like, stick with it.
I love that. Thank you. And we can end it on this one. What message do you hope listeners take away from your story?
Definitely that this is your permission slip to take a break. I want everybody who hears me speak, I want them to hear you are valuable and you are meaningful and your life is important, regardless of whether or not you do anything today, like anything like productive today. You don't have to be doing, you don't have to be hitting goals, you don't have to be achieving, you don't have to be buying the new whatever it is or carrying the right purse or shoes or like none of those things ultimately are important if you are not aligned with who you truly are. And so take that moment of intentional rest and evaluate what is truly important to you, what your values are, and lean into that and have no shame and no stigma with it. And if the next educational thing or the next goal at work, like if that's not worth it for you, don't do it. Like nobody is telling you you have to do it. So be free to do what is right for you and know that your value is not changed by that. Your value is there innately because you are a human.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Naomi. I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time today to share that beautiful message. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, follow, and share this with someone who might need it. Stay tuned for the next one.